So hello, my name is Sarah. I'm presenting on the toxic cost of cheap usernames, reapplying Friedman and Resnick's framework to competitive video game networks. So a brief agenda, I'm just going to be talking a little bit about myself and why I wrote this, going into what toxicity currently looks like in video games, talking about the paper that I will be addressing, social cooperation theory, and then looking into applying their proposals to a modern video game network. A little bit about myself. I'm a Rhodes Scholar. I just graduated out of the Oxford Internet Institute. I'm pretty heavily involved with games. I work as a communications director of the Women's Wargaming Network, which is a nonprofit, and I'm currently a creative researcher at Cheer Studio. My motivation for writing this paper is taking an academic theory heavy paper on the challenges of the internet written in 2001 and applying it to modern day competitive team-based video game network architecture, to see how solutions proposed about 2 decades prior have been or could be realized, for two main reasons. The first is I think that the academic community should engage more with video game toxicity and communities from a theoretical and practitioner's viewpoint. And the second was I thought it was a fun thought experiment and interdisciplinary exercise. So academia tends to disagree a little bit about what toxicity and toxic behavior is. In Dark Participation in Games by Rachel Cohort in 2020, the author finds competing and overlapping definitions used for toxicity and trolling behavior, both in description and application. So my working definition right now is behavior within a game deliberately meant to anger, frustrate, annoy, disrespect, or otherwise create an unpleasant experience for other players. So when I was coming up with this definition and looking into toxicity overall, I actually was referring to what are reportable offenses coming out of actual video games. So League of Legends, for instance, has one of the most extensive frameworks for reportable offenses, such as hate speech, offensive language, intentionally ruining the game for other players by griefing, feeding, or purposely playing in a way to make it harder for the rest of the team, leaving or going AFK, and unnecessary disruptive languages. Online harassment and toxic behavior is a massive problem in gaming. Protected by username, players feel empowered to harass, cheat, or otherwise act out in unsportsmanlike ways. 81% of players surveyed in a Unity 2023 report believe that protecting players from toxic behavior should be a top priority for game developers. The main problem with this is that video game usernames and accounts right now are quote unquote cheap or basically free. And so any bans or regulation attempts can be circumvented simply by making a new account. However, this is an issue that's inherent with the internet, not just online gaming. So when I was reading a paper by Friedman and Resnick on the social cost of cheap pseudonyms, I realized that a lot of what they propose could actually be applied to video game environments. So Eric Friedman is an economics and operations research professor, and Paul Resnick is a professor of information studies. And they published a paper in 2001 when the internet was booming on the problems of societal norms for cooperation and reputation when it is possible to obtain cheap pseudonyms, something that is becoming quite common in a wide variety of interactions on the internet. So they mainly focused on this idea of social cooperation theory, which is how are people incentivized to cooperate, which has a pretty extensive history in research and academia. And they narrow it down to two necessary conditions: reputation and repetition. Repetition is repeated interactions or the possibility of future interactions, which gives people the incentive to cooperate because of future consequences, i.e., if you betray me today, I'll betray you tomorrow. Reputation, whether or not someone is known to be cooperative, is an incentive to cooperate even if interactions are not repeated with the same people. For example, I heard you betrayed someone yesterday, so I'm not going to cooperate with you today. People online feel removed from real-world consequences, so they feel free to act out and be offensive, which is the key challenge with pseudonyms. However, pseudonyms also pose a challenge for reputation and repetition because they can be easily swapped, discarded, and created anew at little to no cost or time lag. You can create a new reputation for a new account, and you can never be sure if you've already interacted with that same person behind a screen. So the paper proposes 4 solutions to this, which I will apply to video game networks. The first is monetary fees or time-consuming account setup. The second is paying your dues and distrust of new users. The third is real-world identification. The fourth is a once-in-a-lifetime identification system. So let's talk about cooperation in video games and what that actually looks like. To flip the definition that I gave for toxicity, non-toxic behavior can be best summed up as cooperation with teammates and with other players under the defined rules of the game and the implicit social norms to create an enjoyable game experience. Video games themselves tend to be zero-sum. Either you and your team wins or the other team wins. But the actual experience of the game is what I'm talking about here, not the result of the game. If one player acts in a toxic manner, it ruins the game for others. The win-win condition in the quote-unquote metagame is the overarching experience of the gameplay itself. Repetition and reputation in video games are very dependent on the game platform and the user base size. The likelihood of repetition or repeated matches is low because player bases are vast. Unless you deliberately make a team with your in-person or online friends, you often will rarely play against each other unless you all exist at a higher rank with a smaller player pool due to MMR, which is an internal matchmaking rating or ranking system. No feasible solution for this really exists because video game companies want to grow, not shrink their player base. Reputation, on the other hand, has two components on a player account: the length of time or experience that a player has accumulated on a platform, and whether or not that player has behaved appropriately. If a player has an account for many years and is at a very high level or rank without being banned, then it's implicitly assumed that they have acted appropriately. Some games also have features where other players can rate their gameplay experience with that account. For instance, League of Legends has an honor system where players rank up or down depending on other players voting on if they played with honor. If they fall too far down, they lose access to gameplay rewards or to gameplay. However, players cannot see each other's honor system. The competitive rank reputation is attached to a specific account and acts as both an indicator of trust, but also as a matter of pride for many players. Video game platforms have experimented with regulation attempts to discourage bad behavior, and most of these rely on actually punishing a player account. However, players themselves mainly have reactive solutions, such as muting, reporting, exiting the game, or blocking other players. Platforms mainly rely on temporarily banning the account for a couple of days or weeks, or permanently banning the account if it's serious enough. However, permanent bans are pretty rare for behavior only and instead mainly used for cheating. Public shaming isn't also used in video games, so there's no social pressure to act cooperatively unless another player directly calls out or defends themselves in-game. There are also third-party websites that aren't officially integrated with platforms that can keep tabs on toxic behavior, but again, this is very much related more to cheating. Tab Stats, for instance, is a tracker for competitive games like Call of Duty or Valorant, and it labels known cheaters thanks to player reports. This label can't be removed, and it's a permanent deterrent against cheating, but only if that player cares and other players care. Apex Legends actually introduced a system in 2019 that paired cheaters with cheaters, so a cheater-only lobby, where cheaters were removed from the community and forced to play against only each other. Regulation tactics for toxic behavior now predominantly focus on cheating rather than offensive language or harassment, even though the latter can ruin a personal player experience far more than cheating will. And gamers can easily sidestep any negative reputation accounts that have received bans by creating a new reputation or a new account, which tends to be pretty fast. Most games also won't have a limitation cap on the number of accounts one person can hold. There's no rule and there's no bannable offense. In fact, it's such a common occurrence to hold multiple accounts that there's an actual definition for it called smurfing, which is creating a second account typically used to stomp on or to easily beat players below the skill level that you have. In 2022, Call of Duty attempted to crack down on the misconduct in a huge move by banning 500,000 accounts. However, players were really skeptical of bans as a solution to toxicity, with one player commenting, and 500,000 new accounts were made. Even the most difficult bans can be easy to get around using VPNs or spoofing hardware IDs. You can also buy a new account. You can also buy a new account. There are plenty of platforms that allow you to purchase accounts for anywhere from $3 to $5. So current regulation attempts assume that players will stay with the same account, which is undermined with the system of free account creation and switching. Players must be discouraged from being toxic on their own account and discouraged from switching to a new account in order to actually address toxicity in gaming. So this leads me to Friedman and Resnick's proposals. The first of which is a resource-intensive count setup, which they actually discount for being ineffective. However, many gaming platforms right now actually have a pseudo version of time cost for new players, while making an account is pretty simple and fast. Using that account to play competitively, also known as playing ranked, requires playing normal or non-ranked matches. For instance, Overwatch 2 requires that players win about 50 quick play matches, and at about 10 to 15 minutes per game, that amounts to over 8 hours invested in one account. This way, players are discouraged from creating new accounts because they have to spend all that time to reach ranked gameplay, which tends to be more fun. However, this still faces the problem of players buying new accounts to get around this time cost. A monetary entry fee is also unlikely to work. For this entry fee to work, Friedman and Resnick argue that it faces the challenge of being high enough to deter wealthy players from abusing the system, but low enough to minimize potential players from being priced out of the game. And they believe that even the most optimal fee will sufficiently fail to accomplish both tasks. A potential solution is to make an account more difficult to get by requiring more than just an email. Similar to real-world identification, we could require that players provide a phone number and confirm that phone number at semi-regular intervals, similar to the way that DoorDash does it. This ups the investment in creating a new account because players will have to go out of their way to obtain a new cell phone number rather than just a new email. But again, there are platforms that you can use to generate a new semi-valid phone service. And so this adds another layer of difficulty, but it's very low integration, low reward. Paying your dues is their second proposal, which is the idea that new accounts require some proof or verification before they can actually get into the system and be trusted. This actually does exist in some forms of games, particularly collaborative games with online trading markets. For instance, EVE Online, players are required to secure transactions within a certain timing hierarchy, but there's no equivalent in competitive team-based games. One potential solution for this is that new players in ranked must pay their dues by first playing a certain amount of matches as a certain role. Typically, competitive team-based games are divided into roles like support, tank, DPS, which is damage per seconds, etc. Across the board in the gaming community, support roles tend to be viewed as the least entertaining because they focus on supporting teammates rather than attacking other players and dealing damage. However, they are always necessary part of the game, and most team matching can't even start until at least one player takes on that role. So new players could be required to play some games as support characters as a way of serving their community, which would incentivize players to stick with their original accounts after putting the time in and increase the time investment for players selling accounts, because if you use just a bot to rank up the account and sit idle, other players will likely report the paid account. That being said, this again is probably going to have a lot of backlash from gamers and be an unpopular solution. One thing that Friedman and Resnick mentioned is simply removing anonymity and requiring a real-world identifier. However, they do not believe this is a good solution for reasons ranging from civil liberties to information exchange. I also agree with this in terms of gaming. Anonymity is critical to gaming for safety, boundary, and immersion reasons. Players want to be immersed within their games, and calling other gamers or themselves by their real-world names tends to break the magic circle. Female gamers are also shown to be subject to greater harassment online. In a 2022 study, 93% of female gamers in a 2,000-person survey admitted to disguising their gender. Removing anonymity also leads into problems like doxing, which is the exposure of personal information online, and swatting, which is creating a fake police report in the hopes of sending a SWAT team to a real location. There actually was some attempts for making real-world requirements in games. Facebook used to require users identified by their real names when logging into a gaming account on their platform, but in 2020, they changed it to a player name system where players could instead use themed avatars instead of their profile pictures and alternative usernames. Forza Horizon in 2021 made gaming news because players were creeped out when the game title screen displayed their real name despite never providing it initially. Eventually, they discovered that Forza Horizon had pulled the data from Xbox Live, where players had inputted their real names, both being under the Microsoft umbrella. However, it was very discomforting for the community overall. Lastly, their final solution is a once-in-a-lifetime system. They propose a system where there is a regulator that gives out user identifications for each platform, all attached to a single identifier with a regulator. So users can't just make new accounts as they please. The way this translates to video games is creating or using an existing multi-game platform, tracker, and regulator. If we have one platform regulator that connects all accounts, then any toxic behavior can be tracked across games. One potential existing platform this could work on is Steam, which already applies some of this idea. Steam is a video game client platform where PC players can buy and access almost every game on the market that is not console specific. They have their own Steam username, but also tend to have separate usernames in whichever game they play. Publishers of video games can issue game bans, and Steam will apply them, which are listed publicly on the player account. This can range from not being able to trade with players to not being able to play the game online. Steam also has its own banning power, which it deploys for scams, cheating, and illegal activity that can remove access to the account or all the games inside it temporarily or permanently. For instance, VAC bans are anti-cheating bans, which ban a player from playing across all secured servers on Steam and are permanent, non-negotiable, and cannot be removed. In my version of a once-in-a-lifetime system, Steam could act as an intermediary by creating cross-video game platform consequences to discourage all forms of toxicity, not just cheating. For instance, if a player misbehaved in a Call of Duty Steam-linked account, they could create a non-Steam-linked account to subvert consequences for misbehavior, but their Steam account and all games attached to it would receive the same consequences that their original Call of Duty account received. Essentially, the Steam account becomes a once-in-a-lifetime identifier with a certain mark next to the username, and all other non-Steam linked accounts on gaming platforms would be subject to greater suspicion. This incentivizes players to remain with their original account because all of their purchases are attached to it, and to behave appropriately on it because the stakes are raised from losing access to purchases and reputations on one game account to losing access to being verified across all gaming servers. This would need an additional layer to be useful. Just knowing another player is potentially toxic because they're playing on an unverified account isn't helpful. They need a way to act on knowledge of another player's reputation. So we could create a system where only Steam verified accounts play with each other, and all non-verified accounts play with each other in a separate lobby. This system is less serious than being permanently banned from the game because you can still access the game, but it removes the ability to ruin the experience for players that don't enjoy toxic behavior. It works in conjunction with current toxicity regulation attempts, and it also sidesteps the complaint that some games have a toxic culture inherently, and it's quote-unquote part of the experience. If some gamers believe that exposure to toxic behavior is a vital part of their gameplay experience, then they can choose to play in the non-verified Steam lobbies. This does require some changes. The once-in-a-lifetime Steam system requires either verifying that players can only make one Steam account, as users are currently permitted to make an unlimited number, or trusting that the convenience and monetary cost of Steam consolidating all purchased games into one platform is a high enough entry fee to discourage most bad actors. So, in conclusion, this research paper was an exploration in how to creatively apply solutions from a similar adjacent field to the more niche field of video game architecture. That being said, a majority of the work right now in academia and toxic behavior regulation is still reactive rather than proactive and internally facing rather than externally available. However, I hope the community continues to use interdisciplinary work to spur creative approaches to reducing toxicity online and encourages greater partnership between video game industries and academic institutions. Quick list of my references, and thank you so much. That is my contact.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Maybe you can put back the content slide because it went super fast. Let's see if we have some questions. So we had a question in the chat. You answered part of it. But why are some games so much more toxic than others? To what extent have your studies explored fundamental ways in which the game itself can be changed to reduce toxicity?
Sorry, I'm just putting my contact in the chat. Yeah, so I think that some games are more toxic than others simply by how competitive they are and how skill-based they are. So League of Legends, Call of Duty, these like first-person shooters, and the League of Legends and Dota specifically tend to be called out as being very toxic. And I think that's not only because they're incredibly competitive, but they've been around long enough that there has been sort of back in like the early 2000s, this culture of speaking a certain way in your language or doing certain actions within the game that was adopted. And so some people still want that culture and still think that culture is normalized, and other people that are getting into games that tend to be more marginalized communities or communities that haven't traditionally been involved in games can feel that those actions that are normalized to other people do not feel as good to them, right? sorry, what were the other questions? To what extent have your studies explored fundamental ways in which the game itself can be changed to reduce toxicity? I haven't done a lot of this, to be honest. I've mainly been focused on the academic field, but I did see some presentations working on this, which is great. And then I'll answer one more question. Are there specific examples of games or game types, genres that both contain a social element and don't necessarily foster toxic behavior? Yeah, there's a lot, but the real question is whether or not those games are competitive. So a lot of like online player games that are collaborative, such as like Binding of Isaac just got multiplayer, Stardew Valley has always had some multiplayer element. All these tend to be like very peaceful games where there's no competitive element. Some solutions that people have tried is very heavily restricting the chat system, right? Only creating a pinging system so you can't actually be toxic verbally to other players. But overall, I think that there needs to be a shift in culture between how we approach online interaction rather than any like UI UX design is more restricting your ability to represent toxic behavior rather than lowering the urge to be toxic itself. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah.